Welcome to the Great Shrimp Shoal. Today we're going to be cleaning out the 30-gallon tank containing the mountains and getting rid of some of the overgrown plants. I hope that you'll join me as it's going to be a very revealing process, and hopefully in the end we'll be able to see the shrimp a little better. It's been a few weeks, almost months, since I have trimmed back any of the plants in the 30-gallon tank containing the mountains. I like to keep things clean, but since these tanks have been in a constant shift with new babies coming and going, I opted to let them all grow out just a bit over the last 3 months. Now it has become too much. The hygrophila is out of control and is starting to poke out of the surface of the water, and the rotala has started to creep around the entire tank. The hairgrass is beginning to look like a splotchy mess, as if it is a porcupine that is missing half of its quills. So, the logical step is to do a bit of maintenance, and that involves a good trim of the plants, a quick clean of the water, and a check of the filter sponges, among other things. It has also been a while since I've done a time-lapse or rundown of these processes in my channel, so I'll let the video run as I talk about what's going on in this tank. First of all, the baby shrimp have been popping up all over the place, but after a few days they disappear, and only after another couple of months do I notice some smaller juveniles have showed up out of nowhere. Obviously, they are not winking in and out of existence, but what's more likely happening is that they are hiding in the nooks and crannies of the giant lava rocks, feeding on the biofilm and avoiding the open ground of the substrate or the plants. I have seen shrimp of the proper size every now and again, but it is not as consistent as seeing babies and then larger juveniles and adults. Meanwhile, the rare pink and orange cream female shrimp are doing well. They seem to be attracting their mates and having baby shrimp often, but I have yet to see young shrimp turn out in their coloration. It's not all unexpected though. These two adults didn't get their new color until much later in their life cycle, sometime after their first year and many moltings. The bamboo shrimp are lumbering around, and they're doing exceptionally well. They're getting more time between moltings, and that could either be a sign of a low tank nutrient or just plain age. As shrimp age, they'll molt less as they grow more slowly over time. The curve of molting and growing is an exponentially slowing curve. I keep trying to catch the molting on camera after I saw it once happen earlier last month, and unfortunately, after weeks and weeks of waiting, it happened again off camera. It just happened to occur when I stepped away to do some work later on in the afternoon, and when I checked on a bamboo shrimp in question, it looked refreshed and much more healthy. In the run-up to the molting, they adopt a much lighter and more milky color, and in the case of these two bamboo shrimp, it appears more orange. Their fresh molted color is closer to a tan and dark brown. Let's get back to the cleaning though. The rotala really needs a trim, and the roots can get a bit grabby for a lack of a better word. When you cut the stem and start to pull out or cut the roots, it can bring up a bunch of the detritus, mulm, and chunks of substrate. Luckily, that debris falls back down pretty quickly once it is disturbed, but it really goes to show you the length that these plants go to suck up nutrients from the substrate down below. The rotala is a perfect example of a plant that just won't live without good substrate and nutrients, as evidenced by the abundance of roots that this plant puts out in its attempt to grab onto the soil. It's no wonder that this plant is at home in the dirt, mud, and silt of our lakes and rivers. So, cut. I've tossed out a ton of rotala since planting it, and I originally grew it from a culture with the original specimens looking more like little sprigs of clovers. They ballooned upwards pretty quickly though, and once they got a hold, each plant sent out a dozen runners or more. It is important to keep your design aesthetics in mind as you trim your plants. Yes, they can get out of control, but that doesn't mean that you can't put things back on track and re-implement your beautiful choices. For me, that's keeping the rotala in some nice tall chunks that frame the lava rocks nicely, breaking up the dark background of the tank and the rocks. It's just that when things get overgrown, it tends to lose that feel. I try to edge it back ever so slightly as I pick which shoots to prune. On to the hygrophila. It too needs a trimming, and even though it grows much more slowly, it has a pretty advanced root structure. If I were to try and pull it up, I would find that it had spread underneath the substrate and to the rocks nearby. So, keeping that in mind, the best tactic is to clip it below an elbow in the stem close to the substrate. Additionally, if you're trying to keep the number of sprouts under control, you could go back to the nearest junction and cut before that split. Hygrophila is also pretty robust, more so than rotala. I've heard people say that just a cutting sprouted roots and propagated a massive colony that clogs small lakes and ditches. So it's best to dispose of this quickly. Hygrophila is a flowering plant too, so once it breaks the surface it would bud and attract pollinators. I keep reminding myself that this plant grew from the tiny seeds that I bought off of Amazon, so let that be a lesson to you. Be extremely careful, and I cannot restate this enough, extremely careful what you buy off of the bigger websites. Better to buy a culture or a cutting instead of seeds, because seeds will grow into something that you don't know yet what it will be. Seed plants are almost never a good idea for submerged aquariums anyways. Speaking of roots, the best plants for propagating via roots in my aquarium by far is the dwarf hairgrass. It was planted in a single clump because it was starting to melt in one of my other aquariums. A few days later, the clump had stabilized, and then a few weeks later it had started to grow, and grow it did. Over the next few months, it bounced from one spot to the next like a daisy chain, using its roots with each node shooting a blade of grass towards the surface. See how it stretches across the tank. I was fortunate enough to get this screenshot recently that my iPhone suggested to me out of my taken pictures. It shows the hairgrass when I first planted it and the hygrophila that I transplanted from the forest into this tank. And that just goes to show you that these big plants had very, very small beginnings. Unfortunately, in a tank like this, the hairgrass doesn't really shine, especially in this fluval stratum substrate. It can only pop up between the kernels, and it doesn't really form a mat or a carpet. Like I said before, as a sparse porcupine, it doesn't really look the best. So I'm trimming the rotala now and the hygrophila. After the trimming is done, I'll gather up all the floating bits of plants because as of now, all the trimmings float to the surface as they're less dense than water. I'll take the trimmings out and add them to the compost heap. To be honest, if I kept the trimmings, I could sell them at this point, as I've gotten rid of so many good stems with roots and solid growth structures over the years. Before wrapping up for the evening, I squeeze the sponge filter intake a bit to get the water flowing again and then turn everything off for the night. I totally expected the tank to settle by the morning, and to be honest, I'd probably get a better view of all the shrimp that I call this beautiful tank their home. Morning came and I was not disappointed. It is clear that the mountain covered in Java moss also needs a good trim, but for now, just paring down the rotala did a lot to help the visibility and probably helped with the oxygen levels in this tank as well. It's actually important to take into consideration having a tank that is too full of plants, because as the respiration reverses at night, oxygenating plants exhale carbon dioxide, lowering the available oxygen in the tank drastically. You basically don't want to let the plants get out of control, as every new leaf is one step closer to maxing out your tank's capacity and dumping your oxygen at night. At first I didn't see anything out of the ordinary, but I was able to spot some newly hatched baby shrimp, and I could see more of what the bamboo shrimp were up to as well. Hopefully I'll be able to set up the time-lapse again and catch one of them molting this time. It's pretty easy to see that the baby shrimp prefer to spend their time in the cracks down on the substrate, and if they're not hanging out in the open, they'll probably be sneaking around in the back of the tank or feeding off of the biofilm somewhere else, a little bit more cloistered. It makes sense that they're not vying for position at the food pellet whenever it's dropped into the tank, especially since most of their competition is nearly 100 times their size. And let's not forget what will happen if the snails get their hands on it. They'll just cover the entire surface of the pellet until there's nothing left for any of the shrimp, let alone the babies. I am sad to admit that I missed the bamboo shrimp molting yet again, and only by mere moments in my estimation. I had been keeping tabs on the lightest of the two shrimp over the last few days and during the cleaning process as well, but when I checked on him at lunch the following day, I saw that the carapace was hanging from the sponge filter. It has happened like this a few times already over the course of these shrimps calling this tank their home. They're crafty little decapods who will use any opportunity to thwart my attempt to photograph their actions. I was, however, able to get some good close-ups earlier that morning, and it was a great way to see the entire body, including all of my favorite parts, the fans and the antenna. These are really beautiful shrimp. First of all, I want to thank you for showing up and watching me clean the tank. I'll have some updates in the next video on where the 20-gallon tank with the cement planter now stands. I've received some mixed feedback from the community, but as of now the water parameters, biofilm, and other benchmarks are well within range. I may also start to get the ghost shrimp acclimated before I put that video up, so we'll have a nice update when next we meet. Until then, I hope that you have some sweet shrimpy dreams. Good night.